Welcome to Monitoring the Success of Your Efforts, Module 3, Monitoring Plans. During this introduction, you may want to take a moment and adjust the volume on your computer so that you can clearly hear the audio. This is the third lesson in the Monitoring Plan module, which is the final module in the Monitoring the Success of Your Efforts series. In Lesson 2, you were introduced to some existing data sources, as well as some tools and resources that can be utilized to collect new data. Now that you have a basic understanding of some of the data sources available to you to help address each of your monitoring questions, it's time to complete the information sources and how do we accomplish this sections of our monitoring plan. Let's walk through the Miracle Math example to help us understand how to consider information sources required to answer each of our monitoring questions. Remember, one data source can often meet multiple needs. The first question asked was, what need does this initiative address? To answer this question, we would want to examine data from information sources such as an inventory of your data, system or school achievement trend documents, and student rosters. Remember to use your indicators, i.e. the data elements such as suspension rates or end-of-grade test scores, to guide exactly what data sources you'll need. And keep in mind that inventorying your data available is a good first step, since it enables you to know exactly what data you already have on hand and what will need to be gathered. Consider listing the indicators that you established on your logic model to know exactly what information you'll need to re-examine. The best information sources associated with describing your program's need, as well as its objectives, i.e. short and intermediate outcomes, and its expected long-term outcomes, are planning documents, such as bone diagrams or interviews or focus groups with your program or initiative stakeholders. Note that the work that you've already done within your logic model will enable you to capture and communicate this information. Next, examine budget records to answer the question, what resources are available, and determine the cost of your initiative and the source of funding. This information may be available through Oracle. Remember, school staff are a resource, so you may want to capture their time as well as know any extra support that may need to be hired. So far, we've only looked at your monitoring questions associated with the plan portion of your monitoring plan. These questions were the focus of your logic model, and thus including them here will simply enable you to capture and reflect the information sources and specify exactly how these questions were addressed. To get a better understanding of what data is appropriate to address questions associated with implementation and outcomes, we need to move down our monitoring plan and look at some additional questions. Next, let's consider sources to address program implementation questions such as, has the project been implemented as planned? If not, why not? What type and level of services were provided through your program? Information sources might be existing project records, for example, staff training rosters, student participation rosters, program schedules, or meeting minutes. Or new data gathered through surveys, interviews, focus groups, or observations. Now that you've established both your monitoring questions and information sources that you intend to use to address those questions, the next column on your monitoring plan captures how we attempt to accomplish this. One way to answer the question, has the project been implemented as planned, is to capture the participant data in a spreadsheet, which will enable you to look at things like percentages, counts, means, and any other analysis which would help you to see if your program or initiative's selection process was followed. To answer the question, how many staff and students were to be served and how many were actually served, you might use records of eligible criteria, students screened, enrollment and participation rosters, and possibly budget pay records. Let's consider the question, how has this project been implemented as planned within our Miracle Math example? If Miracle Math was put in place to address the 3,000 students scoring below grade level, then we would expect these students to be the focus of our initiative. If this was our data for our Miracle Math students, then the selection criteria was not followed, with more than half of our students scoring on grade level prior to service. Understanding this data will help us not to overestimate the percentage of students on grade level following the program, and thus draw inaccurate conclusions regarding Miracle Math's impact on students' achievement. Now that we have considered how we might address a question related to implementation, next let's consider monitoring questions associated with the study portion of our monitoring plan. If we look back at our Miracle Math logic model, we can see that there are a number of short-term outcomes included here. According to this model, if the tutoring program is properly implemented, we would first expect to see all teachers trained, all programs established, and tutoring occurring for 500 students twice a week. In order to determine if these short-term outcomes were met, we would need to examine project records, such as training schedules and rosters, to determine if training occurred and how many teachers attended. We would also have to capture tutoring schedules and program participation rosters to determine if the tutoring sessions took place and if students served met the program selection criteria. Once these activities take place, other short-term outcomes will occur. For instance, once teachers are trained, then teacher understanding of tutoring methods should increase. Over time, we would expect teachers to have positive attitudes towards the approach and use the methods more consistently. In order to assess the success of this second level of short-term goals, we would most likely need to conduct teacher interviews or focus groups and conduct walkthroughs or other observations to capture data which would serve as indicators of the teacher's learning as well as behavior. At this point, you should review the information you've captured and record your initial data to determine if your short-term goals were met. When the teacher's short-term outcomes have been met, students involved will show increased knowledge of formative assessments, consistent attendance at sessions, and increased end-of-grade mastery. With intermediate outcomes met, long-term outcomes will be in range. Thus, within this example, once our intermediate outcomes are met, achievement gaps will be eliminated. All students will graduate on time. Imagine the possibilities. In order to assess the success of learning and behaviors associated with intermediate outcomes, we would need to examine formative data, attendance rosters, as well as end-of-grade achievement data. Finally, the indicators for our long-term goals, i.e. the achievement gaps in the EOG scores and graduation rates, can be examined to determine if the achievement gaps have shrank and graduation rates are up. Keep in mind that your long-term goals may not be fully measurable within the time frame of your monitoring plan. However, long-term goals such as reduced achievement gaps can be measured over time. Now that we have discussed information sources that you can use to address your monitoring questions and consider different ways of capturing and communicating that information, it's time to pause and consider your plan. Prior to beginning the final lesson, complete the information sources, i.e. data you will use to address each of the monitoring questions, and how we accomplish this, i.e. ways of capturing and reflecting that data, columns within your plan. In our final lesson, Module 3, Lesson 4, we will be discussing capturing when the data will be available and who will be responsible. Thank you.